What would you do if the temperature fell to 30 degrees below zero? The wind had nothing to stop it, and the nearest modern furnace was hundreds of years away. You could build a fire, but fire alone would not save you. On the northern plains, winter could turn an open landscape into a place where exposure became dangerous with frightening speed. Wind swept across the prairie without trees or walls to slow it. Snow buried paths, covered landmarks, and piled against anything that disturbed the surface. And yet, somewhere beneath that frozen landscape, a family could be eating dinner. Children could be sleeping. A fire could be burning steadily. And the people inside might be warm enough to remove the heavy clothing that would be essential only a few yards away. From the surface, there might be almost nothing to see. Just a rounded mound of earth. No stone chimney. No tall walls. No obvious house. That apparent absence was part of the genius. Among the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara of the Upper Missouri region, the Earth Lodge became one of the most sophisticated forms of traditional housing on the plains. These were not crude holes scraped into the ground. They were carefully framed structures built from cottonwood, willow, grass, earth, and sod, combining structural engineering, insulation, ventilation, food storage, family organization, and spiritual meaning inside a single circular space. And there is a deeper question hidden inside that design. How did people without modern insulation, heating systems, or engineering textbooks learn to make a structure that worked with the climate instead of fighting it? The answer begins with something beneath every human settlement on Earth: the ground itself. The modern instinct is to think of insulation as something we manufacture. Fiberglass, foam, mineral wool, synthetic membranes. But insulation does not have to be manufactured in a factory. Sometimes the landscape already provides it. The crucial difference between air and earth is that they respond to temperature at very different rates. The thin layer of air surrounding a person can change rapidly when exposed to a bitter wind. A deep mass of soil changes far more slowly. That does not mean every underground chamber automatically sits at a comfortable 50 degrees Fahrenheit, or that simply digging 3 feet into the ground guarantees a particular temperature. Soil temperature varies with latitude, season, moisture, depth, and local geology. The important principle is simpler. The deeper and more massive the earth around a space becomes, the more slowly that surrounding mass responds to rapid changes at the surface. That matters enormously in a winter landscape. A lightweight shelter exposed directly to the wind can lose heat quickly. A heavy earth-covered structure behaves differently. Its thick walls and roof slow the movement of heat. The soil absorbs and releases thermal energy gradually. The wind cannot strip heat from a massive earthen roof the way it strips warmth from exposed skin. Modern sustainable architecture now uses similar concepts in earth-sheltered construction and thermal mass design. But the people who built earth lodges did not need the modern vocabulary. They had something more important: generations of observation. They knew what happened when a roof was too thin. They knew what happened when a doorway faced the wrong direction. They knew how snow accumulated. They knew which timber lasted. They knew how much earth the frame could carry. And they knew because a mistake was not theoretical. A mistake could mean a cold family, a damaged home, or a roof that failed. That knowledge accumulated until construction itself became a form of inherited memory. And nowhere is that more obvious than in the structure of the lodge. Imagine standing on the prairie before construction begins. There is no blueprint, no measuring tape, no power equipment. Instead, the builders establish the center of the future lodge and mark out a large circle. The size could vary dramatically, but earth lodges commonly reached roughly 30 to 60 feet in diameter. Some were smaller, some were larger. A reconstructed lodge at Knife River, for example, is about 40 feet across. The floor was excavated somewhat below the surrounding surface. Then came the structural heart. 4 substantial cottonwood posts were raised near the center. These were not decorative pillars. They formed the central support system from which the roof structure developed. Around them came the outer posts, stringers, leaners, rafters, and other structural members. Willow branches, grasses, and earth were then layered over the wooden framework. The final covering transformed the entire visual character of the building. Wood disappeared. The geometry softened. The structure became a rounded mound. A house became a hill. And that transformation had practical consequences. The earth covering provided mass and insulation. The rounded profile helped distribute the weight of the roof. The structure became less exposed to the full force of wind. The interior became separated from the rapidly changing conditions outside. NPS documentation describes earth lodges as wooden frameworks covered with branches, grasses, and thick earth or sod, with 4 central cottonwood posts forming the core of the roof structure. But perhaps the most remarkable part of this construction story is not the material. It is who controlled the knowledge. In traditional Hidatsa society, women constructed, owned, and maintained the earth lodge. An older woman with both practical and sacred knowledge could supervise the process, passing techniques from one generation to the next. The lodge was therefore more than architecture. It was accumulated knowledge made physical. Every post represented a decision. Every angle represented experience. Every layer of grass and earth represented a lesson learned long before the people living inside were born. And once the roof was complete, the most difficult problem remained. A fire could warm the lodge, but a fire also produced smoke. And smoke had to get out without allowing winter to come rushing in. That problem required another piece of invisible engineering. At the center of the lodge was the hearth. It was the source of heat, cooking, light, and daily activity. But the fire created a dangerous contradiction. If the lodge was sealed completely, smoke would accumulate. If the roof were opened too widely, cold air and precipitation could enter. So the builders created an opening at the highest point of the roof, the smoke hole. Heat naturally rises. As the fire burned, heated air moved upward toward the opening, carrying smoke with it. Fresh air had to enter somewhere else to sustain combustion. The doorway and entrance passage became part of that airflow system. NPS descriptions of earth lodges also note covered or protected entrance passages and a central roof opening used to vent smoke from the fire. In bad weather, the smoke opening could be shielded rather than simply left exposed. This is where the lodge stops looking like a primitive shelter and starts looking like a carefully balanced environmental system. The builders were managing 3 things simultaneously. Heat had to remain. Smoke had to leave. Fresh air had to enter. No fan was required. No electric blower. No thermostat. The system depended on fire, geometry, openings, wind, and the physical behavior of heated air. But the real achievement was not discovering one universal formula. It was learning that architecture had to respond to local conditions. And that becomes obvious when we leave the Missouri River country and travel west. Because the peoples of the plateau solved the cold problem differently. And farther south, ancestral Puebloan builders developed another sophisticated solution to the same fundamental challenge. The shape changed. The materials changed. The cultural meaning changed. But the question remained the same. How do you control the environment without possessing a machine that controls it for you? The term Native American covers an enormous range of societies, environments, technologies, and histories. There was never one universal indigenous house. That distinction matters. A Mandan earth lodge should not be visually transformed into a Pueblo kiva. A plateau pit house should not be treated as a plains earth lodge with different decorations. The similarities are fascinating precisely because the designs remained culturally distinct. Across the plateau and southwest, people developed partially underground or subterranean spaces that used the surrounding earth to moderate the environment. In the Pueblo world, some ceremonial structures, called kivas, incorporated a remarkably deliberate ventilation arrangement. At Pecos Pueblo, for example, reconstructed and documented kiva features include a ventilator shaft, a deflector positioned between the incoming airflow and the fire, a central fire pit, and a roof entry that also functioned as an outlet for smoke. Imagine the sequence. Cooler air enters through the ventilator. It moves toward the chamber. A deflector prevents the incoming current from striking the fire and people directly. The fire heats the air. Smoke and hot air rise. The roof opening provides a route upward. The entire room becomes part of a circulation system. It is easy, from a modern perspective, to call this passive ventilation. But that phrase can hide the human achievement. The system did not appear because ancient people accidentally arranged holes in the right places. The design reflects accumulated knowledge about fire, airflow, shelter, and the behavior of enclosed spaces. And there is a larger lesson here. When different societies repeatedly confront the same environmental problem, they often discover overlapping engineering principles. Not because they shared a blueprint, because physics is shared by everyone. Cold air still moves. Hot air still rises. Mass still stores thermal energy. Wind still finds openings. Fire still consumes oxygen. Human beings simply learn to work with those rules in different cultural languages. And inside the Earth Lodge, engineering never existed alone. It was tied to family, food, ritual, and identity. The greatest mistake we can make when looking at ancient architecture is to judge it only by whether it kept someone warm. An Earth Lodge was not merely a thermal envelope. It was a household, a workplace, a storage system, a social space, and a sacred environment. Inside a traditional Earth Lodge, sleeping areas occupied spaces around the perimeter. Food and possessions were stored in carefully organized areas, and the central fire became the focus of daily life. NPS descriptions also document cache pits used to store foods such as corn, beans, squash, and sunflower. This changes the way we should imagine winter. The family did not simply crawl underground and wait for spring. Life continued. Food was prepared. Tools were maintained. Clothing was repaired. Children learned. Stories were told. Visitors were received. People worked close to the hearth while the weather outside transformed the prairie into a hostile landscape. And because several related family members could share an Earth Lodge, the building itself shaped social life. The architecture created proximity. The walls held warmth, but they also held generations together. The 4 central posts carried structural weight, yet they could also carry cultural meaning. NPS documentation notes that the Hidatsa regarded the spirit of the Earth Lodge as residing in the 4 central posts, which could be wrapped with offerings. So when we look at those 4 posts, we should not see only engineering. We should see engineering and worldview occupying the same space. The roof held up the earth. The fire sustained the household. The lodge protected the family. And the structure itself could be understood as something worthy of respect. That is why the knowledge of building one could not simply be reduced to measurements. You could know where to put a post and still not understand the lodge. You had to understand what the lodge meant. A building can survive only if someone knows how to maintain it. Earth lodges required continual care. Earth settles. Wood ages. Weather attacks exposed surfaces. Smoke darkens interior materials. Snow adds weight. Water finds weak points. The solution was not to construct a perfect building once. It was to create a system that people knew how to repair. Traditional accounts documented by the National Park Service describe earth lodges being rebuilt periodically, with Hidatsa women gathering materials and supervising construction. Some sources give roughly a decade as a common rebuilding interval. That tells us something important. The technology was not a frozen invention from some distant past. It was a living process. A lodge could be improved. Materials could be replaced. Weak points could be corrected. Lessons could be carried into the next structure. This is how sophisticated technologies often develop. Not through one genius suddenly inventing everything. Through thousands of small observations. A roof that failed under heavy snow teaches something. A doorway that creates too much draft teaches something. A timber that lasts longer teaches something. A fire that burns too hot teaches something. A wall that holds warmth longer teaches something. Then those lessons become tradition. And eventually tradition becomes engineering. The most powerful technology in the lodge was therefore invisible. It was memory. A grandmother did not need to call it thermal mass. She needed to know where the earth should be thick. She did not need to calculate computational fluid dynamics. She needed to know how smoke moved. She did not need a structural engineering degree. She needed to know whether the frame could carry the roof. That is not the absence of engineering. It is engineering expressed through generations of lived experience. And that same knowledge affected something even more important than comfort. Survival. The fire inside the lodge was only one part of the survival system. The real battle against winter began months earlier. Fuel had to be gathered. Food had to be grown, hunted, processed, dried, stored, and protected. The architecture itself reflected this seasonal planning. For the agricultural communities of the Upper Missouri, winter survival was tied to the productivity of the entire year. Corn, beans, squash, sunflower, meat, hides, tools, fuel, and other materials had to be managed so that the household could continue functioning when the landscape outside became difficult to exploit. NPS sources emphasize the agricultural and trading economy surrounding Knife River villages and the importance of women's work in producing crops and maintaining household prosperity. Inside the lodge, storage was therefore as important as warmth. A cache pit could preserve food below the floor. Raised platforms could keep possessions organized. Sleeping spaces lined the perimeter. The hearth occupied the center. The building itself became a compact ecosystem. Every square foot had a purpose. And this is where the earth-covered roof becomes even more interesting. From the outside, it looked heavy and almost primitive. Inside, that mass helped separate the household from the violent temperature swings of the open landscape. The people were not trying to make the prairie behave like a modern heated building. They were creating a smaller environment within it. A human-scale climate. The lodge did not eliminate winter. It reduced winter's access to the people inside. That distinction is everything. Because the cold remained outside. The wind still blew. The snow still fell. The river still froze. But the family was no longer exposed directly to the full force of those conditions. The environment had been reorganized around human survival. And perhaps the most remarkable part is that this solution was built almost entirely from materials that already existed around them. Wood, willow, grass, earth, fire, time, knowledge. Modern viewers tend to look for impressive technology in visible objects. A weapon, a machine, a metal tool. Something complicated enough to look advanced. But some of the most sophisticated technologies leave almost no obvious trace. Airflow is invisible. Thermal mass is invisible. Structural load paths are invisible. The difference between a comfortable room and a dangerously smoky one can be determined by a few feet of geometry. That is what makes these buildings so fascinating. The technology was embedded in the arrangement of ordinary materials. A cottonwood post in the right place became structural engineering. A layer of earth became insulation. A central fire became a heating and cooking system. A roof opening became ventilation. A protected entrance became climate control. A cache pit became long-term food storage. and the circular floor became the center of an extended family's life. Nothing about the materials looked futuristic. The intelligence was in the system. This is also why we should be careful about romanticizing the past. These homes were not magical. They were not perfectly warm. People still suffered from cold. Fuel still ran out. Food could still become scarce. Structures could still fail. Disease, conflict, injury, and environmental disasters did not disappear simply because someone understood architecture. The achievement was not that indigenous people made winter harmless. They made survival more possible. That is a much more powerful story because it is real. They did not conquer nature. They learned its rules. And once you understand that, the mound on the prairie begins to look completely different. It is no longer an anonymous hill. It is the visible surface of an invisible system. Now return to that first image. A northern plains winter, 30 degrees below zero. Snow moving across the horizon. The prairie almost completely erased by white. At first, there seems to be nothing there. Then you notice the mound. Rounded, quiet, covered in earth. The wind passes over it. Snow settles against it. From a distance, it looks like part of the landscape, but underneath is a carefully framed human world. 4 central posts hold the roof. Rafters spread outward. Willow and grass fill the framework. Earth seals the structure. A hearth burns at the center. Smoke rises. Families gather. Food waits in storage. Children sleep beneath robes. Someone tends the fire. Someone repairs clothing. Someone remembers how the lodge was built. And somewhere in that chain of knowledge is the answer to the mystery we began with. How could people survive a winter that modern observers might assume required modern technology? Not by possessing a machine powerful enough to defeat the cold. By understanding that the cold did not have to be defeated. It had to be managed. The earth became insulation. The fire became heat. The roof became protection. The smoke hole became ventilation. The household became a living system. And knowledge passed from one generation to the next became the technology that connected all of it. That is the part worth remembering. Because when the last earth lodges were abandoned or replaced, the engineering did not suddenly become meaningless. The physical structures could disappear back into the landscape, leaving circular depressions and archaeological traces behind. Yet the principles remain recognizable in the architecture of today: thermal mass, passive ventilation, earth sheltering, efficient use of local materials, and buildings designed around climate rather than separated from it. The modern world often measures progress by how much technology we can add. These ancient builders remind us of another possibility. Progress can also mean learning to need less. Less fuel, less machinery, less artificial control, more observation, more adaptation, more understanding of the place where you live. So the next time you see an empty stretch of prairie covered in snow, remember that landscapes can hide more than ruins. They can hide solutions. A low mound may look like nothing, but beneath it could be the remains of an idea that helped families endure some of the hardest winters North America could produce. And perhaps that is the lesson buried beneath the earth. Human survival has never depended only on having better tools. Sometimes it depends on seeing what everyone else overlooks: the ground beneath your feet, the movement of air, the behavior of fire, the weight of snow, the wisdom of the people who came before you. The Earth Lodge was not a desperate hole dug into the ground. It was a carefully engineered partnership between human beings and the landscape. And long after the timber rots, the grass disappears, and the mound returns to the prairie, that idea remains. Because the most remarkable survival technologies are not always the ones that rise highest above the ground. Sometimes they are the ones that disappear into it. This is dark origins. And if stories like this make you look at the landscape a little differently, stay with us. There are more forgotten technologies, lost adaptations, and remarkable pieces of human ingenuity still waiting beneath the surface. Until next time, keep looking deeper, because history is rarely as far away as we think. Sometimes it is right beneath our feet.